I like to ask people the question, what are the biggest innovations in automobile engineering over the last 50 or 100 years? And you get all sorts of things. And I'll ask, what are the two biggest advances that we've seen?
I'm going to go with disc brakes.
Okay.
And I'm going to go with, as of late, but of course we're leaving gasoline, I'm going to go with all the gears in a transmission now available.
And I would tell you, you're close, but there ain't no cigar for you today.
I knew I was in danger with you.
No, actually, disc brakes were a significant improvement over what we had in braking. But I would tell you that even more important than what the brakes did is tires. If you can imagine the tires that we run on today, 20 or 30 years ago, they would have been racing tires.
Right.
And when I got into the business, American tire manufacturers were doing nothing but bias ply tires. You had to go to Europe to find radial tires. Now, that said, the bias ply tires that were on American cars, if you were an enthusiast, they were terrible. They really were terrible. They were balloon tires. Back in those days, we had an 80 profile tire, which meant that the distance between where the rim was and how much rubber went from there down to the road was big. So you had a large envelope in which you put air. Air can be compressed, but you can only put certain PSI into the tires. So the bias ply tires were just soft and squishy and didn't grip very well. And really, for American drivers driving on American roads, the emphasis really was on going straight ahead down a highway and with the smoothest possible ride you could have. So handling really wasn't a part of the equation back then. So not many people cared, except for you and I who were enthusiasts and didn't like the fact that these cars didn't turn, didn't stop, didn't go really, and the tires were a big part of that equation. I did with Ron Wakefield the very first tire test that anybody in America ever did. We did it with ROAD&TRACK back in 1972. And we borrowed a 240Z from Datsun, and we arranged to get about maybe 15 different sets of tires. Radial tires is what we were after. That was what we went for, and those tires became the very first tire test ever done by an American magazine.
Now, what was your role with ROAD&TRACK at this time?
I joined in ROAD&TRACK in 1972, and I was the engineering editor. Jim Crow, who was the editor at the time, was in love with Baja, and he loved taking his Jeep Grand Cherokee, down to Baja and spend time down there. And from that traveling to Baja, which he did, he came up with the concept for what became the very first magazine dealing with pickup trucks. It was called PV4, Pickup Van and Four-Wheel Drive. And it was the very first magazine of that type. And when Jim convinced the Bonds that they needed to do a magazine in that field because of what was happening in that field at the time, he went off to do that. So when he went off and he did it at a building a couple blocks away from headquarters, Ron Wakefield, who was the engineering editor at the time, moved up to become editor. And he came looking for me, and he found me, and I became the engineering editor. So we collectively thought up the issue of we need to do tire testing here because it's something that our readers need to know about. And so we had Pirelli and Michelin, and we had some early types of other bias belted tires, etc., that we tested as well. But the reality is that the European tires ran away with the results. whether it was straight line traction, whether it was traction in the wet, whether it was cornering, braking, you name it. The radial tire was just a much more superior tire than anything we had. The problem in America at that time is that there were two different types of molds. You had a clamp-shaped mold. So think about two halves of a shell, of a clamshell going together. And that was the technology that was used for making a bias ply tire. A European tire required segmented molds. So they had to have pieces that that sort of laid down all around the tire. And you couldn't build radial tire on what would be a clamshell mold. So it would have meant huge investments by the tire companies to go to radials. I mean, ultimately they did. But what we saw happening was sort of a bias belted tire. They could use the clamshell mold, and they could still put belts to help stabilize the tire, somewhat like a radial, but not anywhere as good, by using these belts. And you could use the same clamshell molds. So that was the first evolution from the Detroit industry, from bias ply tires to the bias belted tires. I can tell you, I got some of the earliest bias belted tires that Chrysler was getting from Goodyear to put on a Barracuda that I had. I had a 66 Barracuda Formula S, much better tire than what they had. But the problem was that within about 2 weeks, every one of those tires had bulges in the sidewalls, and they had to be replaced. So that technology wasn't, I mean, it's like any other new technology. It took a lot more development than they probably thought. And maybe some of us were driving harder than they expected people to drive. Yeah.
So what about innovation number 2 in automotive?
So small that you could overlook it very easily. But it's the thing you find in any device like this these days. It's the microchip. When you and I were growing up in the heyday of muscle cars, I mean, there's never been anything before or after that's had the performance and the capabilities of cars that came from the middle 60s into the very early 70s.
Right.
What did I just say? Did I say that you can't buy a Corvette today that has 700 horsepower, has 25 miles per gallon and 60 miles an hour on the freeway, and is as clean as a whistle? Huh?
Well, I mean, really, if you think about 0 to 60 times, many cars can blow away the muscle cars of those era. I mean, and God forbid the electrics.
Well, they blow them away in every single way you can think of. Whether it's
right, they stop and turn too. Yeah,
top end, quarter mile. There's nothing like performance, and it's all because of the microchip. The microchip gave us back horsepower. It gave us fuel economy like you can't believe, and it gave us engines so clean that you can't measure the emissions. I mean, literally a Chevy Corvette with 650 horsepower that you can buy for $60,000, the best performance value on the planet or off the planet these days. From the performance perspective, literally, when you're driving down the freeway at 60 miles an hour, I mean, it's like you're at an idle speed. It's like 1,000 or 1,200 RPM. It's all it is, and it's giving you 25 or 30 miles per gallon. And I mean, it's clean. It's not giving you any emissions, and it's all because of what we've been able to do with that microchip.
This has been Jeff Stearns, Connected Through Cars.